Picture this: a windswept coastline, icebergs glinting under the midnight sun, and a settlement bustling with life. The Norse Vikings didn't just survive in Greenland's unforgiving wilderness, they thrived. For centuries, their farms dotted the fjords, their churches stood tall, and their communities flourished in a land where few dared to settle. But then, something unimaginable happened. These resilient people, who had mastered one of the harshest environments on Earth, vanished without a trace. No final battles, no mass graves, just empty homes, abandoned tools, and a mystery that has haunted historians for hundreds of years. What could have driven an entire civilization to disappear? Was it the creeping cold of the Little Ice Age starving them out? Did conflicts with the Inuit turn deadly? Or did they simply pack up and sail away, leaving behind everything they'd built? The clues are scattered like fragments of a shattered saga, whispers in the Greenlandic soil, cryptic entries in medieval texts, and eerie silence where there once was life. This isn't just a historical puzzle, it's a human story of survival, adaptation, and ultimately, an enigma that defies easy answers. Today, we're stepping into the footprints of the Greenland Vikings, retracing their final days to uncover what really happened. We'll sift through the latest archaeological discoveries, revisit the theories that have divided scholars, and piece together the haunting possibilities behind their disappearance. This isn't just about solving a cold case, it's about understanding how even the mightiest civilizations can vanish into thin air. So settle in, because the story of the Greenland Vikings is about to take you on a journey where history, mystery, and the raw power of nature collide. Erik the Red didn't earn his fiery nickname by backing down from a challenge. Exiled from Iceland for murder, he set his sights west toward a land shrouded in myth and ice. What he found was Greenland, a place far greener in his telling than in reality, but still ripe with possibility. In the late 1000s, he established the first Norse settlements, carving out two distinct colonies along the fjords: the eastern settlement near modern-day Qaqortoq and the western settlement closer to Nuuk. These weren't just makeshift camps, they were full-fledged communities, complete with farms, churches, and even a cathedral. The Vikings didn't just survive here, they engineered a way of life. They built turf-walled longhouses, their roofs insulated with layers of sod to trap heat against the Arctic cold. Their farms, though small by European standards, were meticulously planned, with livestock like cattle, sheep, and goats grazing on pastures that at the time were surprisingly fertile. Archaeologists have found butter churns, cheese molds, and even remnants of barley, proving these settlers weren't just hunters, they were farmers, coaxing sustenance from a land that offered no guarantees. But how did they manage it? Greenland's climate during the medieval warm period was milder than today, with longer growing seasons and less sea ice. The Norse adapted by borrowing techniques from the Inuit, like hunting seals and walrus for meat, blubber, and ivory, a commodity that became their lifeline to Europe. Trade records show ships laden with walrus tusks sailing back to Norway, where Greenlandic ivory fetched hefty prices. Churches like Hvalsey, whose stone walls still stand today, weren't just spiritual centers, they were symbols of permanence, proof that these settlers intended to stay. Yet the land always had the upper hand. Soil samples reveal a slow but steady erosion as overgrazing and climate shifts turned pastures to dust. The very adaptations that kept them alive, like relying on livestock, may have been their undoing when the Little Ice Age crept in. For now, though, the settlements thrived, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of nature's indifference. The Greenland Vikings didn't just endure, they built a society that for centuries defied the odds. But as we'll soon see, even the hardiest civilizations can reach a breaking point. Life in Greenland's Norse settlements was a delicate dance between old-world traditions and new-world necessities. Inside those sod-roofed longhouses, families gathered around central hearths, their walls lined with benches that served as both seating by day and beds by night. Smoke curled lazily upward through small roof openings, a constant reminder of the fight against the cold. But what filled those smoke-stained cooking pots? Contrary to popular Viking stereotypes, their diet wasn't just roasted meat and mead. Seal and walrus meat provided crucial protein when winter locked the fjords in ice, while cattle and sheep offered dairy products like skyr, a thick yogurt that could last for months. Archaeologists analyzing middens have found something surprising: the bones of caribou and even polar bears, proof that these settlers adapted their hunting strategies to survive. Yet Greenland's soil held stubborn limits. Barley, the hardiest Norse crop, struggled in the short growing seasons, leaving bread a rare luxury. Instead, they turned to seaweed and Icelandic moss, foods of desperation that left telltale marks on teeth found in graves. This precarious balance between livestock and wild game reveals their unspoken reality. One bad hunting season or failed harvest could tip a family into starvation. But they weren't just surviving, they maintained a social hierarchy mirroring Scandinavia's. Ruins of larger estates with separate byres and chapels suggest wealthy landowners, while smaller dwellings hint at tenant farmers paying rent in walrus ivory or sealskins. Trade was their lifeline to Europe, and it flowed both ways. Ships arriving from Norway carried iron tools, church bells, and even glass beads, prestige items that reaffirmed their Scandinavian identity. In return, Greenland exported what became known as narwhal ivory, though it was actually walrus tusks, meticulously smoothed and polished. These tusks weren't just trade goods, they were currency. Church records from Bergen show Greenlandic ivory settling debts, funding pilgrimages, even buying indulgences. The church itself stood at the heart of this cultural continuity. At Brattahlid, Erik the Red's own estate, his wife Thornhild built Greenland's first chapel, a turf structure so small the congregation likely stood outside during services. Yet later excavations unearthed fragments of stained glass and bronze censers, evidence that Greenland's Norse clung to their faith with European pomp. But perhaps the most poignant artifacts are the everyday ones: a wooden chess piece carved from driftwood, its Nordic patterns still visible; a broken spindle whorl showing women maintained textile work; even a child's shoe identical to those found in Bergen. These weren't rough frontier imitations, they were careful recreations of homeland crafts, proving that for generations Greenland's Vikings considered themselves Europeans first, colonists second. Their churches held Latin sermons, their graves held crucifixes, and their sagas still spoke of returning home to Norway. This cultural stubbornness may explain their fate. Where the Inuit flexibly followed migrating game, the Norse doubled down on their failing farms, their identity tethered to a way of life that Greenland's changing climate would no longer support. For nearly 4 centuries, Greenland's Norse enjoyed a climatic sweet spot, the medieval warm period, a time when temperatures across the North Atlantic were unusually mild. Between the late 9th and early 13th centuries, summer sea ice receded enough to allow steady shipments from Europe, while pastures stayed green long enough to sustain livestock. Pollen samples from Norse farms reveal something astonishing: layers of barley and rye grains, proof that crops once grew in soil that today lies frozen and barren. The settlers even cultivated small orchards of crowberries and angelica, herbs they used for medicine and flavoring. This wasn't just survival, it was abundance, a window of opportunity that made Greenland's rugged fjords feel almost hospitable. Then the Earth's thermostat began to turn. By the early 1300s, the first whispers of change appeared in the ice cores of Greenland's glaciers, tiny bubbles of ancient air, trapped for centuries, showing a steady drop in global temperatures. The Little Ice Age wasn't a single catastrophic event, but a slow, insidious shift. Growing seasons shrank by weeks, then months. Pastures that once fed herds of cattle now yielded only scrub grass, forcing farmers to slaughter animals they could no longer feed. Sea ice, once a seasonal nuisance, began creeping farther south each winter, choking the vital shipping lanes to Europe. A single bad year might have been manageable, but this was a relentless squeeze, decade after decade of colder summers, longer winters, and disappearing margins for error. The Norse response to this crisis reveals their tragic miscalculation. Instead of adapting their farming techniques or embracing the Inuits' nomadic hunting lifestyle, they doubled down on tradition. Archaeologists find bones of malnourished cattle in middens, animals kept alive far past the point of practicality, as if the mere act of maintaining their European way of life could ward off the changing climate. Trade suffered catastrophically. A single iceberg-laden voyage could delay a ship for years, and by the mid-1400s, records show Norwegian merchants skipping Greenland altogether, opting for safer routes to Iceland. The last written account of the Norse colony comes from a wedding at Hvalsey church in 1408, a bittersweet snapshot of normalcy, performed against a backdrop of encroaching ice and silent trade routes. What makes their struggle so haunting is the contrast with their Inuit neighbors. While the Norse starved in their longhouses, the Thule people thrived. They built flexible snow houses, followed migrating seals, and crafted clothing from animal skins that far outperformed wool in the deepening cold. The Norse, for all their ingenuity, had tied their fate to a single, brittle system, one that assumed Greenland would always resemble the greener lands they'd left behind. By the time the last church bell fell silent, the lesson was written in the empty fields and abandoned hearths. Civilization is no match for a planet that refuses to stay still. The first encounters between Norse settlers and the Thule Inuit must have been a shock for both sides. Imagine a Norse hunter, clad in woven wool and iron, coming face to face with an Inuit family gliding across the ice in sleek sealskin kayaks, their faces framed by fur-lined hoods. These two cultures had developed survival strategies worlds apart. The Norse anchored to their farms and livestock, the Inuit masters of mobility and ice. For decades, archaeologists believed there was little contact between them, but recent discoveries tell a different story. At Norse sites, researchers have found Inuit arrowheads and carved soapstone figurines, while Thule camps have yielded fragments of metal tools, likely Norse iron traded or scavenged. This wasn't just coexistence, it was a hesitant, uneven exchange between civilizations with vastly different visions of how to live in Greenland's harsh embrace. The Inuit thrived because they saw the land as something to move with, not conquer. While Norse settlers stubbornly replicated European farming methods, the Thule followed the rhythms of sea ice and migrating herds. Their diet was a seasonal ballet seal in winter, caribou in summer, fish year-round. They built temporary winter homes of snow and stone, then dismantled them when the hunt called them elsewhere. Even their clothing was a marvel of adaptation. Waterproof sealskin parkas, double-layered for insulation, far outperforming Norse wool in Greenland's damp cold. When the Little Ice Age tightened its grip, these differences became life and death. The Inuit simply shifted their hunting grounds, while the Norse watched their pastures wither under unrelenting frost. Conflict was likely inevitable. Norse sagas speak of mysterious skraelings, a term dripping with disdain, who attacked settlements. At Sandnes farm in the western settlement, archaeologists uncovered a Norse skeleton with an Inuit-style arrowhead embedded in the chest. Yet there are hints of softer interactions too. At a Thule site near Disco Bay, someone carefully repurposed a piece of Norse ship timber into a sled runner. And at the Norse farm of Narsak, walrus bones show cut marks from both iron knives and sharpened stone, suggesting shared butchering practices. The tragedy is that the Norse never fully learned from their neighbors. They continued relying on brittle trade routes and vulnerable livestock, even as the Inuits' flexible ways proved superior. By the time the last Norse family abandoned their crumbling longhouse, the Thule were already wintering in its empty halls, turning Norse failure into Inuit opportunity. What lingers in these silent encounters is a lesson about cultural stubbornness. The Norse could have adopted kayaks for seal hunting or switched to skin clothing, just as they'd once adapted turf-building techniques from Iceland. Instead, they clung to the markers of European identity: woolen garments, dairy diets, even the impractical keeping of cattle, as if these traditions could shield them from a changing world. The Inuit, by contrast, treated survival as a puzzle to be resolved each season. When Norse ships stopped coming, when the last priest recited the final Latin Mass, Greenland's ice didn't mourn. It simply waited for those who knew how to listen. For the Greenland Norse, walrus ivory wasn't just a commodity, it was the backbone of their survival. Every tusk hauled from the icy waters of Disco Bay represented a lifeline to Europe, traded for the iron tools, timber, and sacramental wine they couldn't produce themselves. But by the late 1300s, that lifeline began to fray. African elephant ivory flowing into Europe through expanding trade networks flooded the market. Smoother, easier to carve, and available in larger quantities, it rendered Greenland's walrus tusks obsolete almost overnight. Records from Bergen's trade guilds show a stark decline. Where Greenlandic ivory once filled warehouses, by 1400 it barely warranted a footnote in ledgers. The Norse found themselves stranded on the wrong side of globalization, their niche product eclipsed by a cheaper, more abundant alternative. Ships from Norway, once regular visitors, now arrived sporadically, if at all. A single vessel might skip Greenland for years, deterred by the treacherous ice and dwindling profits. The consequences were catastrophic. Without steady trade, the colony's iron tools grew scarce. Archaeologists find evidence of desperate repairs: knives resharpened until they were little more than slivers, axes patched with makeshift rivets. Even church bells, symbols of spiritual connection to Europe, were melted down for metal. The Greenlanders' isolation became a vicious cycle. Fewer ships meant fewer supplies, which made survival harder, which made voyages even less appealing to merchants. A letter from 1424, sent by the last known bishop of Gardar, pleads for a ship to rescue the colony's remaining Christians. It's unclear if it ever reached its destination. What makes this economic collapse so poignant is how avoidable it might have been. The Norse had other resources: falcons, polar bear hides, even narwhal tusks, that could have diversified their trade. But their rigid commitment to the ivory trade left them vulnerable. Where Icelandic settlers adapted by exporting wool and fish, Greenland's Norse clung to a single, failing industry. By the time they realized their mistake, the ice had closed in, both literally and economically. The last flickers of commerce weren't with Europe, but with passing Inuit hunters, who occasionally bartered scraps of metal for Norse wool, a bitter irony for a people who once saw themselves as the inheritors of a mighty Scandinavian legacy. The silence of those abandoned trading posts speaks volumes. In the end, the world moved on, leaving Greenland's Vikings stranded in the past. The abandoned settlements of Greenland's Norse colonists hold secrets in their silence. Step inside a reconstructed longhouse at Brattolith, and you'll find something unsettling: a wooden loom still strung with half-finished wool, a rusted iron cauldron tipped over as if its owner meant to return, even a child's tiny mitten dropped near the doorway. These aren't staged museum displays, they're snapshots of real moments frozen in time. Archaeologists call this phenomenon perishable abandonment, the eerie preservation of everyday life interrupted. At Hvalsey, the best-preserved Norse site in Greenland, the stone walls of the church stand untouched, its doorway still facing east toward Jerusalem, as if waiting for a congregation that never came. Beneath the floorboards of these homes lies darker evidence. Skeletal remains from the Western settlement tell a story written in bone. Teeth pitted with horizontal grooves, a condition called hypoplasia, reveals cycles of starvation during childhood. Femurs stunted from malnutrition, spines curved under the weight of relentless hardship. Some graves hold entire families buried together, their bones so brittle they crumble at the lightest touch. Yet there's no mass grave, no cache of weapons or scorched timbers to suggest a violent end. Instead, the evidence points to a slow unraveling. At the farm of Nyakusat, excavators uncovered a storage room still stocked with dried cod, food left behind in haste as if the owners expected to retrieve it. The most haunting clues come from the smallest details. A set of caribou antlers half carved into a comb, abandoned mid-stroke when the artisan walked away. A pair of shoes placed neatly by a hearth, their owner likely barefoot in the snow outside. Even the livestock pens tell a grim tale. At Gardar, the bishop's estate, the bones of a newborn calf were found nestled against its starved mother, a poignant symbol of a way of life that could no longer sustain itself. What makes these sites so compelling is what's missing. No hoards of buried treasure, no barricaded doors, no evidence of epidemic disease, just the quiet, accumulating weight of small failures. A winter too long, a ship that never arrived, a pasture that wouldn't green. The Norse didn't vanish in a single dramatic exodus. They faded like embers in a dying fire, leaving behind the ordinary remnants of lives that expected to continue. In the end, the most telling artifact may be the simplest, a single candle stub found in Hvalsey's church, its wax barely burned. Who blew it out and why remains one of Greenland's last unspoken mysteries. The record of the Hvalsey wedding in 1408 reads like the last page of a book torn off mid-sentence. Preserved in Icelandic annals, it's a mundane detail. Thorstein Olafsson and Sigrid Björnsdottir, both from prominent families, exchanging vows in that remote stone church by the fjord. Witnesses signed the document, the bishop's seal was stamped, and then nothing. No accounts of their life afterward, no records of children born or funerals held. Just silence stretching across the centuries. What makes this event so haunting isn't the ceremony itself, but the void that follows. Like a candle snuffed out without smoke, the Norse colony vanishes from history with no fanfare, no explanation, only unanswered questions. Hvalsey Church, where the wedding took place, offers cryptic clues. Its walls, still standing today, show no signs of violence, no scorch marks from attack, no hastily barricaded doors. Instead, archaeologists found something far more ordinary. A broken spindle wall near the altar, a rusted axe head by the door, and faint scratches on the floor where pews once stood. These aren't artifacts of panic, they're the quiet leftovers of gradual departure. The wedding may have been one of the colony's final acts of normalcy, a desperate performance of tradition as the world around them crumbled. Ships from Norway had likely stopped coming by then, stranding the guests with no way to carry news back to Europe. The absence of later records speaks volumes. Medieval Europe was meticulous about documenting tithes and sacraments, especially in a bishopric like Gardar. That no priest wrote of funerals, no trader logged voyages after 1408 suggests the end came quickly. Perhaps a single catastrophic winter wiped out the last holdouts, or maybe the remaining families dispersed in small groups, absorbed into Inuit communities or attempting a doomed voyage back to Iceland. The Inuit oral tradition tells of encountering pale strangers along the coast around this time, living in makeshift camps and speaking a garbled version of Old Norse. Could these have been the last Greenland Vikings, their European identity fraying into myth? What lingers at Hvalsey isn't just mystery but melancholy. That wedding represents a crossroads between hope and resignation, between history and oblivion. The guests likely drank imported wine from cracked goblets, wore moth-eaten finery patched with sealskin, and danced to hymns that would soon be forgotten. They couldn't have known they were etching their names into the final chapter. In the end, the Norse didn't so much disappear as fade, like footprints in Greenland's shifting snow, one moment distinct, the next erased by the wind. The starvation theory paints a grim picture of Norse inflexibility. their stubborn adherence to European farming methods even as the land turned against them. Skeletons from the Western settlement revealed telltale signs of chronic malnutrition, stunted growth in children, dental lesions from cyclical famine, and bones riddled with osteoporosis from calcium-deficient diets. At first glance, it's easy to assume their downfall was sheer cultural stubbornness, a refusal to abandon cattle for sealskin kayaks, but the archaeological record tells a more nuanced story. Middens near longhouses show a gradual shift over generations, early layers packed with bones of cattle and sheep, later ones dominated by seal and caribou remains. By the 1300s, Norse diets included up to 80% marine mammals, a stark departure from their Scandinavian roots. This dietary adaptation wasn't just survival, it was a quiet revolution. At the site of Garden under Sandet, researchers found seal bones with precise butchering marks matching Norse iron tools, disproving the myth that they disdained Inuit hunting methods. They may not have adopted kayaks or harpoons, but they clearly learned to harvest the sea's bounty. Even their livestock strategies evolved. Goats, better suited to sparse grazing than cattle, became more prevalent in later years. Yet adaptation has its limits. Unlike the Inuit who followed migrating seals across the ice, the Norse still tethered themselves to fixed farms. Their seal hunts were likely seasonal, clustered near home fjords rather than ranging far afield. When the Little Ice Age pushed seal populations farther north, the Norse found themselves trapped between dwindling herds and failing pastures. A single bad winter could tip the balance, like the one hinted at in a 1400s ice core, showing unprecedented snowfall that would have buried fodder stores and frozen coastal hunting grounds. The tragedy isn't that they refused to change, but that they changed too slowly. By the time Norse families were boiling seaweed and gnawing on leather straps for sustenance, the Thule Inuit had already mastered the art of survival in the new climate. The starvation theory captures part of the truth, but it's not a tale of blind stubbornness. It's a lesson about the cost of cultural identity in a shifting world, where the line between tradition and survival grows thinner with each passing winter. Disease has always been the silent reaper of civilizations, striking without warning and leaving behind shattered communities. Could an epidemic have been the unseen force that wiped out Greenland's Norse settlers? At first glance, the theory seems plausible. Europe was ravaged by the Black Death in the mid-1400s, a pandemic so devastating it wiped out nearly half the continent's population. If ships from infected ports had reached Greenland, the results could have been catastrophic for a small, isolated colony with no immunity to such virulent strains. Yet when archaeologists comb through Norse sites, they find no evidence of mass graves, no hastily dug pits filled with skeletons. Instead, the burials are orderly, with bodies laid to rest in consecrated ground, often with crosses clutched in their hands. The absence of mass graves doesn't entirely rule out disease, though. Some illnesses leave no visible marks on bones, and in a community already weakened by malnutrition, even a mild infection could have been lethal. Take, for example, the skeletal remains from Hvalsey, where researchers found signs of anemia and chronic infections, conditions that wouldn't kill outright but would make surviving a brutal winter nearly impossible. There's also the grim possibility of invisible pathogens. Unlike the Black Death, which left telltale lesions on bones, viruses like influenza or dysentery leave no trace in the archaeological record. If a ship carrying sick crew members arrived during a critical shortage of supplies, the combination of starvation and contagion could have been a death sentence. But here's the twist: Greenland's isolation might have actually shielded it from Europe's deadliest plagues. The colony's trade connections were fading long before the Black Death peaked, and by the time the pandemic swept through Norway, few ships were making the perilous journey west. The last recorded voyage to Greenland was around 1420, decades before the plague reached Scandinavia. Even if disease had struck earlier, the Norse had one advantage their European kin didn't: distance. Outbreaks thrive in densely packed cities, not scattered farms separated by miles of icy fjords. The most compelling counterpoint comes from the Inuit. If a virulent disease had swept through the settlements, why didn't it jump to nearby Thule communities? The two groups had enough contact for trade metal fragments appear in Inuit sites, but there's no oral history or archaeological evidence of a devastating illness among them. Unlike the Norse, the Inuit population remained stable even as their neighbors vanished. This discrepancy suggests that if sickness played a role, it was likely a final blow to an already collapsing society, not the sole cause. A malnourished population, grappling with failing farms and severed trade links, would have had little resilience left when the next crisis arrived. Disease may not have been the spark that destroyed the Greenland Norse, but it could have been the wind that snuffed out their last embers. Among the icy fjords where Norse and Inuit hunting grounds overlapped, tension simmered like a pot left too long over the fire. Inuit oral histories speak of violent encounters with the Kvlunate, their term for the Norse describing battles where arrows flew and blood stained the snow. At Sandnes farm, archaeologists uncovered the skeleton of a Norseman with an arrowhead lodged between his ribs, its shape unmistakably Inuit. Nearby, another grave held a woman's remains with a skull fracture consistent with a club or hunting weapon. These aren't isolated finds. Multiple Norse sites show defensive adaptations, like collapsed tunnel entrances that could be barricaded from the inside. Yet interpreting these clues isn't straightforward. The arrowhead at Sandnes might signal a raid or a tragic accident during a tense standoff. Norse sagas, while steeped in bias, mention trade with the Skrælings before relations soured. At the Dyrnes site, Thule artifacts were found carefully placed inside a Norse longhouse, suggesting periods of uneasy coexistence. The truth likely lies somewhere between total war and sporadic skirmishes. Inuit hunters competing for the same dwindling seals and caribou may have seen the Norse as rivals, especially as the settlers increasingly encroached on traditional hunting territories. What tilts the scale against conflict as the sole cause of disappearance is the lack of wholesale destruction. No Norse settlement shows signs of large-scale burning or mass graves. At the Western settlement's final layers, abandoned tools lie neatly stacked, homes intact but emptied of valuables, more like a planned departure than a rout. Even the skeletal evidence reveals a grim nuance. Many Norse remains show signs of prolonged malnutrition, implying they were already weakened when violence occurred. The Inuit, masters of Greenland's changing ecology, had little reason to exterminate a faltering community. Their oral traditions describe finding deserted Norse farms, not conquering them. A more plausible scenario is that clashes exacerbated existing crises, stealing winter food stores, disrupting hunts, or fracturing already fragile social ties. Like a house collapsing under its own weight, the Norse may have succumbed to many pressures, with conflict delivering the final nudge. The arrow in that Sandnes skeleton tells only part of the story, not of a single catastrophic battle, but of a slow unraveling where every lost life made survival just a little harder for those left behind. Cultural identity can be both a lifeline and an anchor. The Greenland Norse clung to theirs with a fierceness that defied logic. They wore wool in a land where sealskin meant survival, kept cattle when goats required less fodder, and built churches while their food stores dwindled. This wasn't just practicality, it was a performance of Scandinavian identity, as if maintaining European customs could ward off the creeping reality of their isolation. Yet the archaeological record reveals a quiet contradiction. Beneath this stubbornness lay pockets of adaptation. Norse middens show increasing reliance on seal meat, and at some farms, bones of Arctic foxes, animals the Norse once ignored, appear with butchery marks. They were learning, but incrementally, like sailors bailing water from a sinking ship with a thimble. The Inuit's kayak offers the sharpest contrast. Light, maneuverable, and perfectly suited to hunting seals amid drifting ice, it was a marvel of Arctic engineering. The Norse had ships sturdy, ocean-crossing Nars, but these were useless for daily hunting. Why didn't they adopt the kayak? The answer may lie in their social hierarchy. Norse society revolved around landownership and livestock. A man's status was tied to his farm, not his skill with a harpoon. To abandon cattle for kayaks would have upended their entire worldview, reducing chieftains to mere hunters. At Gardar, the bishop's estate, archaeologists found rusted scythes, tools for harvesting hay that no longer grew, but not a single scrap of kayak frame. The symbolism is heartbreaking. They prioritized cutting grass that wasn't there over learning to hunt what was. Yet adaptation flickered at the edges. Some Norse did borrow Inuit techniques, just not the ones that mattered most. They adopted the toggle harpoon for walrus hunting, a tool far superior to their iron spears. At Narsak, a Norse pendant carved from walrus ivory bears an uncanny resemblance to Inuit spirit figures, hinting at cultural exchange. Even their clothing tells a story of compromise. While outer layers remained wool, excavated garments from Hvalsey show sealskin linings stitched into the seams for added warmth. These weren't rejects of Inuit wisdom but half-measures, as if they hoped to survive without fully surrendering who they were. The bitter irony is that the Norse had adapted before. In Iceland, they'd swapped timber longhouses for turf walls to withstand the wind. In Greenland, they'd innovated with subterranean food storage to keep dairy from freezing. But when faced with the Inuits' radical mobility, they faltered. Perhaps it was pride or fear or simply the weight of tradition. Whatever the reason, their partial adaptations formed a tragic bridge, one that stretched toward survival but never quite reached the other side. The Inuit thrived because they saw themselves as part of Greenland's ecology. The Norse saw Greenland as something to reshape in Europe's image. In the end, the land demanded not compromise but surrender, a lesson written in empty longhouses and unturned soil. The idea of a mass exodus back to Europe lingers like a ghost in Greenland's quiet fjords. No dramatic final battle, no skeletal remains piled high, just empty homes and the unsettling possibility that the Norse simply left. But if they did sail away, where did they go, and why does history remember nothing of their return? The logistics alone would have been daunting. By the 1400s, the sturdy Nars that once ferried settlers across the North Atlantic were rotting in Greenland's harbors, their timbers splintered by ice and neglect. Building new ships required iron nails and tar, commodities that had grown vanishingly rare as trade collapsed. Even if a few seaworthy vessels remained, the journey back to Iceland or Norway meant weeks on open water, navigating pack ice with no guarantee of safe harbor. For a population already weakened by hunger, the voyage could have been a death sentence in itself, yet there are tantalizing hints that some may have tried. Icelandic annals from the early 1500s mention strangers from Greenland, appearing sporadically, bedraggled families speaking archaic Norse, their clothing patched with sealskin, their stories fragmented by trauma. One account describes a small boat washing ashore near Reykjavik with two emaciated survivors aboard, babbling about abandoned settlements and a great darkness over the land. Another references a group of Greenlanders who supposedly reached the Orkney Islands, only to perish from an unknown illness weeks later. These fragments are maddeningly vague, more rumor than record, but they share a common thread. The travelers were never reintegrated into European society. Whether they died en masse or scattered into obscurity, their fate was the same as those who stayed behind erasure. The silence of European record speaks volumes. In an age where every barrel of fish and bolt of cloth was meticulously logged, the sudden arrival of hundreds of Norse refugees would have left bureaucratic ripples. Church registries would note baptisms of Greenlandic children. Trade ledgers would list their possessions sold for bread. Instead, there's only absence. Perhaps the survivors were too few, too broken to register as a historical event. Or maybe their homecoming was deliberately suppressed. A colony founded with papal approval, now a testament to failure, was best forgotten by kings and bishops alike. The cruelest twist: the Norse may have left too late. Tree ring data from Norway reveals a string of catastrophic harvests in the early 1500s, coinciding with the last possible migration window. A ship limping into Bergen would have found a homeland gripped by famine, its ports hostile to hungry mouths. For Greenland's Norse, Europe was no longer a refuge but another dead end. The doors had closed behind them long before they thought to turn the handle. The windswept coasts of Greenland hold whispers of a forbidden kinship, a possibility buried in Inuit legends and etched in the very bones of their descendants. Somewhere between the Norse settlements and the Thule camps, the line between enemies and family may have blurred. Inuit oral histories speak of blue-eyed strangers who joined their winter hunts, traded iron for furs, and in time took Inuit wives. These stories, passed down through generations, hint at a truth far more complex than simple disappearance. Recent genetic studies add weight to these tales. DNA analysis of modern Greenlandic Inuit reveals traces of European ancestry dating back to the Norse era, fragments of a legacy woven quietly into the population. At the heart of this theory lies a single archaeological puzzle: the Nanowok site, where excavators uncovered a small Norse-style turf house intermingled with Thule artifacts. Inside, they found a soapstone lamp of Inuit design alongside a rusted Norse knife, its handle carved with Nordic runes. More tellingly, the bones of both seal and cattle lay together in the midden, suggesting a household that blended two worlds. Nearby, at Kangiota Ilutak, another discovery fueled speculation. The grave of a woman wearing a thimble of Norse design, her parka trimmed with European-style embroidery, yet buried with traditional Inuit grave goods. Was she a Norse woman adopted by the Thule, or perhaps the child of a union between cultures? Not all scholars embrace this narrative. Critics point out that the genetic evidence amounts to less than 1% of modern Inuit DNA, scant proof of widespread integration. And while Inuit legends describe contact, they also emphasize conflict, portraying the Norse as aloof and often hostile. The famed Greenlandic historian Ingi Cleavan once noted that the stories paint the Norse as ghosts in sealskin, figures who flickered at the edges of Inuit society but never truly belonged. Yet other clues resist easy dismissal. In the Unatok region, a carving on a walrus tusk depicts two figures, one with the hooded parka of an Inuit hunter, the other wearing a Norse-style tunic, their hands clasped in what could be friendship or solemn agreement. And at Ilutalik, an Inuit elder's account from the 1920s describes pale children, born into the community generations earlier, their unusual features explained by distant Norse ancestors. The most compelling argument for integration may be ecological. As the Little Ice Age intensified, survival demanded flexibility. A Norse hunter who married into an Inuit family gained access to kayak-building knowledge, migratory routes, and shared hunting grounds. In return, his iron tools and livestock management skills could offer his new kin a lifeline. This wasn't surrender, it was pragmatism, a quiet rewriting of identity in the face of extinction. The Inuit, after all, had weathered climate shifts for centuries. Their adaptability was their strength. For a handful of Norse, joining them might have been the only path to seeing the next spring. The silence of the Norse records on this matter speaks volumes. European scribes would have deemed such unions scandalous beneath mention, but the land remembers what parchment omitted. In the end, the question isn't whether some Norse assimilated, but how many, and whether their descendants still walk Greenland's shores today, carrying fragments of a vanished world in their blood. The collapse of Greenland's Norse society wasn't just about ice and starvation. It was a crisis of faith in those who led them. Imagine a bishop's empty throne in Gardar, the once grand cathedral where masses echoed for centuries, now silent. By the 1400s, the church's authority had crumbled alongside its tithes. Records show the last appointed bishop never even set foot in Greenland. He stayed comfortably in Norway, collecting rents from a flock he'd never meet. Without ordained priests to perform sacraments, marriages went unblessed, children unbaptized, and the dying unshriven. For a people whose identity was entwined with Christendom, this spiritual abandonment may have been as devastating as any famine. Archaeology reveals a stark divide between the elite and the struggling majority. At Brattolith, Erik the Red's descendants lived in relative luxury, their storerooms stocked with imported wine and fine textiles long after common farmers resorted to chewing sealskin for sustenance. The bishop's estate at Garthar boasted a byre for 30 cattle, an unthinkable extravagance as lesser families slaughtered their last cow. This wasn't just inequality, it was a failure of Norse leadership's most sacred duty, redistribution. In Iceland, chieftains were expected to open their storehouses in lean years, earning loyalty through generosity. Greenland's elites, it seems, chose self-preservation over solidarity. The ruins of churches tell a haunting story of social fracture. At Hvalsey, someone painstakingly carved a crucifix into the wall, its lines deep with devotion. Yet just decades later, the same church's altar was stripped bare, its chalice and paten likely melted down for trade. Elsewhere, pews were repurposed as firewood, and in one chilling case, a grave was dug directly through the church floor, a sacrilege unthinkable in the colony's heyday. These weren't acts of invaders but of desperate Norse themselves, their faith in both God and lords eroded by unending hardship. Class tensions may have sparked violence. At the western settlement Sandnes Farm, excavations uncovered a chieftain's hall with its doorway deliberately blocked by rubble, as if sealed from within during a final stand. Nearby, the bones of a young man showed signs of blunt force trauma, his body left unburied. Was this a revolt against leaders who hoarded food while children starved? Or the last gasp of a hierarchy collapsing under its own failures? The Norse sagas speak of bloody feuds over scarce resources. In Greenland, with no wilderness left to flee to, such conflicts could have been apocalyptic. The true tragedy lies in what followed the elite's downfall. Without centralized authority to organize seal hunts or distribute iron tools, each family was left to fend for themselves. A single missed hunt or failed fishing trip could doom a household, and with no ships arriving to replenish supplies, knowledge itself began fading. Blacksmiths died without apprentices, carpenters without passing on their craft. By the end, the few survivors may have gazed at the abandoned bishop's crozier or the rusting remains of a forge, wondering how their world had unraveled so completely. The churches, once the heart of Norse Greenland, stood empty not because faith was lost, but because those who promised to sustain it had broken their covenant with the land and its people. The land beneath the Norse settlers' feet was changing long before the glaciers began their slow advance. Walk through Greenland's fjords today, and you'll find patches of bare soil where grass once grew thick, a silent testament to an ecological disaster centuries in the making. When archaeologists dig through layers of sediment at abandoned Norse farms, they uncover a troubling pattern. The deeper they go, the richer the soil. Top layers tell a story of exhaustion, dusty, lifeless earth littered with the bones of starved livestock. This wasn't just bad luck, it was the consequence of 1,000 small choices. The Norse arrived during the medieval warm period, a time when Greenland's southern coasts boasted pastures capable of supporting European-style farming. But their agricultural practices were better suited to Scandinavia's forgiving soils. They cleared forests of dwarf birch and willow for fuel and construction, removing the very roots that held thin Arctic topsoil in place. Livestock, especially sheep, grazed the same patches year after year, their hooves compacting the earth until rain and wind carried it away. At Narsak, soil cores show a dramatic shift. Layers rich in grass pollen abruptly give way to sterile dust, all within a few generations. The settlers didn't realize they were farming on borrowed time. Evidence of this slow crisis hides in unexpected places. At Gardar, the bishop's estate, researchers found a curious feature, a series of trenches dug parallel to the slope. These weren't irrigation channels but desperate attempts to trap eroding soil, a technique the Norse likely remembered from Iceland's volcanic landscapes. It didn't work. Pollen analysis reveals that as the Norse expanded their farms, native grasses like lime grass, crucial for stabilizing dunes, disappeared, replaced by invasive weeds better suited to disturbed ground. Even their prized livestock became agents of destruction. Goat bones from later settlement layers show signs of severe malnutrition, their teeth worn down from gnawing on woody shrubs after the grass was gone. The real tragedy lies in what the Norse failed to learn. While Icelandic farmers developed rotational grazing and turf replanting to counter erosion, Greenland settlers doubled down on tradition. At a farmstead near Igaliku, excavators uncovered a storage room filled with barley, a crop that hadn't reliably grown there for decades. Outside, the fields were littered with the bones of newborn lambs that had perished in spring storms, their mothers too weak from foraging on denuded hillsides to protect them. This wasn't just environmental change, it was a culture unable to see its own role in the disaster unfolding around it. What makes this degradation so haunting is its inevitability. Soil samples from the Western settlement show that even before the Little Ice Age's coldest years, pastures were producing less than half the biomass they did when the Norse first arrived. A single storm in the late 1300s dumped layers of sand across entire farms, burying fields under sterile drifts. The settlers responded by moving livestock to higher ground, only to repeat the cycle on untouched slopes. By the time the climate turned decisively against them, the land had already lost its ability to buffer the blow. The Norse didn't just face a changing climate, they faced the consequences of having treated Greenland as if it were a land that could never be exhausted. The sea ice didn't just block ships, it severed an umbilical cord. For generations, Greenland's Norse had depended on annual trading vessels from Norway like clockwork, their holds crammed with iron ingots, timber for repairs, and even mundane luxuries like honey or linen thread. But as the 1400s dawned, those sails grew rarer, appearing once a decade, then vanishing altogether. Ice cores from the period tell the story in frozen layers, expanding pack ice that turned the Denmark Strait into a shifting maze of bergs. A single unlucky captain could lose his ship to the floes, discouraging others from risking the voyage. The last royal ship ordered to Greenland, commissioned by King Erik of Pomerania in 1424, never returned, likely swallowed by the same ice that was strangling the colony. Without these lifelines, the Norse faced shortages that chipped away at their way of life. Blacksmiths, once revered for crafting tools and weapons, became powerless as their iron stockpiles dwindled. Excavations at Sandnes revealed a smithy abandoned mid-project, its anvil surrounded by half-forged nails and a shattered whetstone, the Viking equivalent of a mechanic's garage running out of spare parts. Families repurposed everything. Broken scythes became knives, church bells melted into fishhooks, even rusted hinges were hammered into arrowheads. The psychological toll of this scarcity surfaces in small finds like a carved wooden doll at Hvalsey, its face painted with faded blue pigment imported from Europe decades earlier, a child's treasure hoarded long after its source disappeared. The silence from Europe carried its own cruelty. Imagine a priest at Gardar Cathedral, scanning the horizon each summer for the ship that would bring news of wars, papal decrees, or simply that Norway remembered they existed. Instead, only the creak of icebergs answered. Letters found in the Vatican archives revealed desperate attempts to maintain contact. One from 1430, addressed to the Bishop of Gardar, pleads for any word from Greenland and mentions sending 6 ships that apparently never arrived. This isolation warped their sense of time. Dendrochronology shows Norse builders reused timber from older structures, their repairs becoming less precise as collective memory of proper European techniques faded. By 1400, a Greenland-made chair might have crude Viking-style carvings, but the joints were lashed with sealskin rather than properly pegged, a quiet surrender to irrelevance. Worst of all was the creeping doubt. These were people who measured their worth by their connection to Christendom. Without priests to perform last rites or bishops to confirm their children, their very identity as Europeans unraveled. At a farm in Vatnavafi, someone scratched a crude map into a walrus tusk not of Greenland, but of Norway's coastline, as if terrified the homeland's shape would vanish from memory. Another artifact, a miscopied Latin prayer book from Hvalsey, shows words jumbled by a scribe who no longer understood their meaning, just the ritual of writing them. The Norse didn't just starve for food, they starved for validation that their existence still mattered to the world beyond the ice. Yet in their darkest hours, they clung to symbols with heartbreaking tenacity. The last graves at Hvalsey hold corpses buried in woolen tunics stitched with increasingly ragged embroidery, threads unraveled from older garments to mimic European fashions no longer seen firsthand. One man was interred with a makeshift crucifix fashioned from driftwood, its crossbar fastened not with nails but walrus ivory pegs. These weren't just burials, they were declarations whispered against the wind, "We are still Norse." Even as the ships stopped coming, as the Latin prayers slurred into nonsense, as the ice closed its jaws around their history, they refused to let go of who they'd been. The tragedy isn't that they forgot, it's that Europe forgot them first. The church wasn't just a spiritual anchor for Greenland's Norse, it was the very foundation of their social order. From the moment Erik the Red's wife Hild built that first small chapel at Bratolith, Christianity became the thread stitching these far-flung settlers to Europe's cultural tapestry. But by the late 1300s, that thread began to fray. When Bishop Alfred died in 1378, no replacement arrived from Norway for over 30 years. Imagine the ripple effects: marriages performed without clergy, the dead buried without last rites, children growing up never hearing a proper Latin Mass. This wasn't just a religious crisis, it was an existential one. For a society where the church collected tithes, settled disputes, and even distributed trade goods, the bishop's absence left a void no chieftain could fill. Power in Norse Greenland flowed through the church's hands, sometimes literally. At Garthar, the bishop's estate sprawled across prime farmland, its barns housing more cattle than all but the wealthiest farms. Tithes paid in butter, wool, and precious walrus ivory, stockpiled in storerooms that doubled as the colony's economic reserve. When times were lean, those stores were meant to feed the hungry. But excavation records reveal a grim pattern. As the 1400s progressed, the bishop's seal appears on fewer and fewer redistribution ledgers. By 1420, the last remaining priest at Hvalsey Church was writing desperate letters not to Greenland's bishop, who hadn't been seen in decades, but directly to the Pope, pleading for a ship to bring sacramental wine and oil. The silence from Rome must have been deafening. The church's decline mirrored Greenland's unraveling in miniature. Take the case of the bells, those resonant symbols of Christian authority. Early settlement churches boasted cast bronze bells imported from Norway, their peals echoing across fjords to mark canonical hours. Yet by the 1400s, archaeologists find only silence, bell fragments repurposed into fishing weights, their metal too precious to leave unused. At Hvalsey, someone scratched a crude crucifix into a walrus tusk, a makeshift substitute for the missing altar cross. Even faith itself began to blur. Graves from this period show startling mixes of Christian and pagan symbolism. One burial included both a crucifix and a Thor's hammer amulet, as if hedging spiritual bets. What's most haunting isn't the church's collapse, but how its absence exposed the fragility of Norse society. Without bishops to mediate, long-standing feuds over grazing rights or hunting territories turned violent. At the western settlement Sandnes Farm, the charred remains of a church door suggest it was barricaded during some final confrontation. Nearby, a chieftain's skeleton bears wounds inconsistent with hunting accidents, perhaps vengeance from tenants pushed too far by unfair tithes. The church had been more than a house of worship. It was the glue holding together a brittle hierarchy. When that glue dissolved, so too did any collective will to survive. Yet even in abandonment, the churches tell a story of stubborn devotion. The last dated artifact from Norse Greenland isn't a weapon or tool, it's a fragment of a parchment missal found at Hvalsey. Its ink faded but still legible, per omnia secula seculorum, forever and ever. Someone kept reciting those words long after the bishops stopped coming, long after the trade ships vanished, clinging to the rhythm of a faith that had once made them feel less alone. In the end, the church didn't fail Greenland's Norse. The world beyond the ice failed the church, and with it, an entire civilization's reason to endure. The story of Greenland's Norse is written not just in abandoned longhouses and rusted tools, but in the very bones of the settlers themselves, and what they reveal is a genetic time bomb. When researchers analyzed skeletal remains from the Western settlement, they uncovered something startling. A population so small and isolated that cousins were likely marrying cousins, generation after generation. DNA extracted from teeth and femurs shows alarmingly low genetic diversity, with certain markers repeating in nearly every individual. This wasn't just a quirk of history, it was a slow-moving catastrophe. In a community already battling starvation and climate shifts, a shrinking gene pool could have been the unseen factor that tipped them toward extinction. Consider the evidence from a mass grave near Narsak, where 7 adults and 3 children were buried together. Dental analysis revealed that 6 of them shared an unusual enamel defect, a genetic trait so rare in medieval Europe that its prevalence in Greenland points to severe inbreeding. Worse still, infant mortality rates climbed sharply in the colony's final decades. Excavated cradle graves show newborns with congenital abnormalities, twisted limbs, cleft palates, and one heartbreaking case of an infant buried with a carved wooden toy, its spine fused in a way that modern geneticists associate with recessive disorders. These weren't random tragedies, they were the inevitable consequences of a population cut off from the genetic replenishment that kept European communities resilient. The Norse had arrived in Greenland with what scientists call a founder effect, just a few hundred settlers carrying a fraction of Scandinavia's genetic diversity. Normally, new arrivals would have diluted this risk over time, but Greenland's isolation made that impossible. Trade ships brought iron and timber, not fresh faces. By the 1300s, computer models suggest the effective breeding population had dwindled to fewer than 50 genetically distinct individuals. That's fewer than some endangered species today. The effects would have been insidious: reduced fertility, weaker immune responses, and children inheriting the same harmful mutations from both parents. A single epidemic, like the one that ravaged Iceland in 1402, could have wiped out entire family lines in one stroke, yet the cruelest twist lies in the Norse's own cultural choices. While the Inuit actively sought marriage partners from distant bands to strengthen their gene pool, the Norse clung to European notions of status and land inheritance. Excavated farmsteads showed generations buried together, suggesting sons rarely ventured far to find wives. At Gardar, the bishop's own skeletal remains show advanced spinal degeneration, a condition linked to inbreeding, yet his position would have required him to father children, passing those fragile genes onward. Even their livestock suffered. Cattle bones from late-period farms reveal stunted growth and brittle limbs, mirroring the decline of their owners. The irony is that genetic collapse might have been preventable. Iceland faced similar pressures but avoided disaster through occasional influxes of New Guinea Scottish slaves, Irish monks, even the odd shipwrecked sailor. Greenland's Norse, by contrast, built walls around their gene pool as surely as they built turf walls around their farms. When the last bishop sailed away in 1424, he didn't just take the colony's spiritual leadership, he took one of its last chances for fresh genetic material. In the end, the Norse didn't just starve or freeze. They may have quietly withered from within, their bodies as exhausted as the overworked soil beneath their feet. No single storm, famine, or battle can claim responsibility for the disappearance of Greenland's Norse. Their downfall was a perfect collision of pressures, each amplifying the others like falling dominoes. Imagine a society already weakened by generations of soil depletion, now facing a cooling climate that shortened growing seasons. Add severed trade routes starving them of iron and timber, while their leaders clung to European traditions that made survival impossible. This wasn't a single knockout blow, but death by 1,000 cuts, each one deepening the next. The brilliance of modern archaeology lies in revealing how these forces intertwined. Ice cores from Greenland's glaciers show the Little Ice Age didn't arrive overnight. It crept in, dropping average temperatures by just 1 or 2 degrees over decades. That slight shift meant barley couldn't ripen, grass grew sparser, and sea ice choked the fjords for longer each winter. Yet climate alone doesn't explain why the Norse didn't adapt as the Inuit did. Their economic collapse sealed their fate just as decisively. When walrus ivory lost its European market, Greenland's lifeline snapped. Excavated workshops in the Western settlement tell this story in rusted tools, blacksmiths reduced to recycling nails into fishhooks, their forges cold for lack of iron. Without ships, knowledge itself began to atrophy. A 1400s-era carpenter might remember how to build a Norse-style longhouse but lack the proper nails or timber to replicate it. This scarcity bred desperate choices. Church bells melted down, ancestral swords reforged into hoes, even wool from burial shrouds unraveled to mend living children's clothes. Yet even this might have been survivable if not for their cultural blinders. The Norse viewed themselves as Europeans first, Greenlanders second. Where the Inuit wore flexible sealskin, the Norse shivered in wool, their garments woven with pride but poorly suited to the wet cold. Their churches remained central even as their congregations starved. One skeleton at Hvalsey was buried clutching a crucifix made of driftwood, his stomach cavity empty of food but his identity intact. The cruelest twist, some combination of these pressures might have been manageable alone. If the climate had stayed stable, their failing farms could have limped along. If trade had continued, they might have imported grain to offset poor harvests. If they'd fully embraced Inuit hunting techniques, they could have weathered the economic storm. But together, these forces created a trap with no exit. Soil erosion meant fewer livestock, leading to less wool for trade goods, which meant fewer ships arrived with iron, making seal hunting harder, which increased reliance on failing farms, a feedback loop spiraling toward collapse. The archaeological record shows their world shrinking literally and figuratively. Later settlements cluster near the coast, as if clinging to the ghost of a trade route, while inland farms stand empty, their doorways choked with sand. Perhaps the most poignant evidence comes from their final years. At a farmstead in Vatnovafy, someone painstakingly repaired a broken spindle wall with sealskin lashings, a tiny act of defiance against the unraveling. Nearby, a child's grave holds a toy carved from a walrus tusk, its surface worn smooth from love. These weren't people who gave up easily, yet in the end, their greatest strength, their unshakable Norse identity, became their undoing. To survive Greenland's changes, they would have needed to become something new, blending with the Inuit or abandoning their farms entirely. Instead, they remained Vikings to the last, their empty halls standing as monuments to a simple truth. Sometimes the price of holding onto who you are is losing everything else. Modern science is peeling back the layers of Greenland's frozen soil, revealing secrets the Norse themselves might not have known. Ice cores drilled from Greenland's glaciers act like climate time capsules. Tiny air bubbles trapped for centuries tell us exactly how cold it got during the colony's final years. One particularly brutal snapshot from around 1400 shows a sudden temperature drop of nearly 4 degrees Celsius in just 2 decades. That's like New York's winters abruptly matching Siberia's with no time to adapt. But the real revelation comes from analyzing the ice's chemistry. Layers of sulfate spikes point to volcanic eruptions in the 1300s, their ash veiling the sun and triggering years of failed harvests across the North Atlantic. For the Greenland Norse, already teetering on the edge, these might have been the first dominoes in their collapse. Then there are the bones, not just of the Norse but of the animals they relied on. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains reveals a dietary slow-motion crisis. Early settlers' bones show signatures of land-based proteins, beef, dairy, and barley, echoing their Scandinavian roots. But as the centuries passed, nitrogen isotopes shift dramatically, telling a story of desperation. By the 1300s, Norse diets were 80% seafood, a stark departure from their European identity. The most haunting detail: some skeletons show seasonal starvation patterns, winter months where they survived on nothing but thin seal broth, their bones recording the famine like tree rings. Cutting-edge techniques like protomics now identify specific diseases hidden in dental plaque. One recent study found traces of Enterococcus bacteria in Norse teeth, suggesting chronic gut infections from spoiled food during long winters. Even their livestock suffered. Cattle bones from late-period farms show signs of rickets, a vitamin D deficiency caused by generations of animals kept indoors too long, their barns darkened to conserve heat. Perhaps the most poignant discovery comes from a humble garbage heap. At a western settlement midden, archaeologists sifted through centuries of discarded seal bones. Early layers show careful butchering, every scrap of meat and blubber harvested. But the final layers before abandonment tell a different story. Bones cracked haphazardly for marrow, even the gristle scorched and eaten. These weren't the meals of people adapting, they were the last acts of the starving. The irony is that Greenland's ice, which ultimately defeated the Norse, now preserves their story with perfect clarity. As glaciers recede with modern warming, they expose long-buried artifacts: a woolen mitten here, a rusted knife there, each one a pixel in the larger portrait of a society unraveling. Science hasn't just given us answers, it's shown us how many questions remain. The Norse didn't leave a written record of their end, but their bones, their trash, even the air they breathed are speaking for them at last. Greenland wasn't the only Norse colony to vanish into the mists of history. Just a few centuries earlier, their ambitious cousins had briefly planted roots in a place they called Vinland, modern-day Newfoundland. Unlike Greenland, where settlers clung to life for generations, Vinland's experiment lasted barely a decade. The difference: adaptation. In Vinland, the Norse encountered indigenous peoples who outnumbered them and fiercely defended their land. Sagas tell of skirmishes with the Skrælings, likely the Beothuk or Micmac, whose arrows and sheer numbers made colonization unsustainable. The Norse retreated, not because of climate or starvation, but because they couldn't overpower the existing social and ecological order. Greenland, by contrast, seemed empty at first glance, a blank slate where European ways could dominate until the land itself pushed back. Later colonies would echo Greenland's fate in eerie ways. Take Roanoke, the infamous lost colony of 16th century North America. Like the Norse, the English settlers arrived during a time of climatic instability, the tail end of the Little Ice Age. When supply ships delayed by storms finally returned, the colony was deserted, its buildings dismantled, and the word Croatoan carved into a post. The parallels are striking: dependence on overseas resources, hostile relations with local indigenous groups, and a stubborn adherence to European customs in an environment that demanded flexibility. Were the Roanoke colonists absorbed by the Croatan people, as some theories suggest? Or did they, like Greenland's Norse, fade away from a combination of isolation and ecological mismanagement? Both cases leave us with fragments, artifacts without context, names without stories. The common thread in these collapses isn't just bad luck, it's a refusal to hybridize. Successful colonies throughout history, from the Mongols in China to the Normans in Sicily, thrived by blending with local cultures. Greenland's Norse might have survived had they fully adopted Inuit hunting techniques, just as the Roanoke settlers could have learned from the Croatans' agricultural practices. Instead, both groups treated indigenous knowledge as inferior, doubling down on familiar but ill-suited traditions. The Spanish in Mesoamerica, for all their brutality, at least integrated local crops like maize and chocolate into their diet. The Norse, however, kept malting barley in a land where it barely sprouted, while the English at Roanoke starved rather than forage like the Algonquian tribes around them. Yet not all failures were equal. The Norse at least persisted for centuries. Roanoke vanished in 3 years. Greenland's collapse was slow, a society unraveling thread by thread, while Roanoke's end was abrupt, a single storm or conflict possibly sealing its fate. And unlike Greenland, where the Inuit eventually reclaimed the land, Roanoke's disappearance created a vacuum, a mystery that overshadowed the indigenous narratives of the region. The contrasts remind us that colonial failure isn't monolithic, it's a spectrum shaped by environment, leadership, and sheer chance. What unites these lost colonies is their legacy as cautionary tales. They show the limits of cultural arrogance, the fragility of supply chains stretched too thin, and the hubris of trying to tame a land without listening to it. Greenland's Norse, Vinland's short-lived adventurers, Roanoke's vanished families, all thought they could bend a foreign world to their will. In the end, the land bent them instead, leaving behind ruins and questions that still haunt us. Their stories whisper the same lesson. Survival belongs not to the strongest, but to those who adapt. The vanishing of Greenland's Norse has sparked imaginations far beyond academic circles, morphing into a playground for mythmakers and storytellers. From sensational documentaries claiming the Vikings went native to wild theories about their integration into Native American tribes, the line between history and fantasy often blurs. One persistent legend, fueled by the infamous Kensington runestone in Minnesota, suggests a band of Norse survivors trekked across North America, leaving behind cryptic carvings. Never mind that linguists have debunked the runestone as a 19th-century hoax. The idea of rugged Vikings forging a secret life among indigenous communities persists, a romantic antidote to the grim reality of their fate. Hollywood hasn't helped. Films and TV series love to depict the Greenland Norse as fearless explorers who either battled mythical creatures or mysteriously disappeared into the Arctic wilderness. One particularly egregious History Channel special even floated the idea that they were abducted by extraterrestrials, their empty settlements serving as evidence of otherworldly intervention. These portrayals strip away the real human tragedy, the slow, grinding collapse of a society, in favor of flashy, unsolved mystery tropes. Even the popular video game Assassin's Creed Valhalla weaves a fictionalized Norse Greenland into its storyline, complete with sword fights against shadowy cabals, a far cry from the historical struggle to milk starving cows in a frozen barn. Then there's the pseudo-history that twists archaeology to fit preconceived narratives. The Vinland map, once touted as proof of Norse knowledge of North America, was revealed to be a mid-20th century forgery, its ink containing modern chemicals. Yet it still crops up in sensational books arguing for a vast Viking empire in the New World. Similarly, fringe theorists point to alleged Norse artifacts in places like Oklahoma or Maine, usually misidentified farming tools or outright hoaxes, to claim the Greenland settlers migrated south. These myths ignore the fact that Norse travel was coastal, crossing thousands of miles of unfamiliar terrain, especially while malnourished, defies logic. The most damaging myth, though, is the notion that the Norse failed because they were weak or inferior. This ignores the incredible resilience of people who lasted nearly 5 centuries in one of Earth's harshest environments. Their story isn't one of defeat but of complexity, a cautionary tale about cultural rigidity, ecological limits, and the fragility of even the hardiest societies. Modern climate change lends their disappearance eerie relevance. Their farms didn't fail because they were lazy, but because the world beneath their feet changed faster than their traditions could adapt. Perhaps the deepest irony is how the Norse themselves became myths. In Inuit oral traditions, they're sometimes remembered as ghostly figures, tall, pale strangers who vanished like mist. European chroniclers turn them into symbols of frontier tragedy, while New Age mystics spin them as ecological martyrs. The truth, as always, is messier and more profound. The Greenland Norse didn't need aliens or secret migrations to make their story compelling. Their real legacy, written in eroded soil, silent churches, and the bones of those who outlasted hope, is haunting enough. The story of Greenland's Norse is more than a historical mystery. It's a mirror reflecting our own precarious dance with a changing planet. Their disappearance whispers urgent lessons about what happens when cultural pride outpaces adaptability, when traditions become shackles instead of tools. These settlers didn't fail because they were weak. They faltered because their vision of survival was too rigid to bend. Today, as glaciers retreat and sea levels rise, their choices resonate with uncomfortable clarity. Take their relationship with the land. The Norse treated Greenland's fragile ecology like a Scandinavian farm, relentlessly grazing livestock on soil that couldn't regenerate. Pollen samples tell the story: lush grasses replaced by invasive weeds, pastures reduced to dust. They saw the land as something to dominate rather than collaborate, with a mindset hauntingly familiar in modern industrial agriculture. Now, as desertification claims farmland worldwide, from the American Midwest to the Sahel, we're confronting the same truth the Norse ignored: ecosystems have limits. The Inuit, by contrast, thrived because they moved with the land's rhythms, taking only what it could replenish. Their legacy reminds us that sustainability isn't about control, it's about balance. Then there's the peril of cultural isolation. The Norse didn't just lose trade routes, they severed ties to new ideas. When ivory profits vanished, they kept carving the same tusks instead of pivoting to new commodities. Meanwhile, European blacksmiths were innovating with water-powered forges, and Inuit hunters were refining harpoon designs. The Norse, trapped in their echo chamber, missed every chance to evolve. Sound familiar? Modern societies clinging to fossil fuels while renewable tech advances elsewhere face the same trap. Progress doesn't wait for tradition to catch up. But the most haunting parallel lies in their response to climate shifts. The Little Ice Age didn't obliterate Greenland's Norse overnight, it gave them generations to adapt. They had front-row seats to the Inuit survival tactics: flexible housing, seasonal migration, skin clothing. Yet they dismissed these innovations as beneath them, doubling down on wool and cathedrals. Today's climate crisis offers a similar choice. Coastal cities can elevate infrastructure or pretend the tide won't rise. Farmers can embrace drought-resistant crops or pray for rain. The Norse teach us that denial isn't just stubborn, it's fatal. Yet within their failure glimmers a paradoxical hope. At the very end, some Norse did change. They ate more seal, patched wool with hides, even traded quietly with the Inuit. These small acts prove adaptation was possible, just too little, too late. Our advantage is that we have their story as a warning. When Greenland's ice melts faster than predicted, when crops fail where they once thrived, we don't have to echo their mistakes. We can choose to see tradition as a foundation, not a cage. The Norse didn't vanish because the world became uninhabitable. They vanished because they couldn't imagine inhabiting it differently. Their bones, buried under permafrost and time, urge us to do better. After centuries of debate, the fate of Greenland's Norse remains shrouded in ice and uncertainty, but modern research has narrowed their disappearance down to a collision of forces. Climate change, economic isolation, cultural stubbornness, and sheer bad luck wove together into a noose that tightened slowly, then all at once. The Little Ice Age didn't just chill their fields, it severed their lifeline to Europe, stranding them without iron for tools or timber for repairs. Their refusal to fully adopt Inuit hunting techniques left them malnourished in a land teeming with food, while their rigid social hierarchy collapsed under the weight of famine and failed leadership. Even their genes betrayed them, their shrinking gene pool amplifying every hardship. This wasn't a single catastrophe, but death by 1,000 cuts, each one deepening the next. The likeliest scenario, a slow unraveling. The eastern settlement likely clung to life into the mid-1500s, its last residents ragged, half-starved, and forgotten by Europe, finally abandoning their churches to the wind. Some may have tried sailing east, only to vanish in the ice-choked seas. Others might have merged with Inuit bands, their European identity dissolving like salt in water. But the most haunting possibility is that the last Norse simply walked away from their longhouses one winter, their footprints erased by snow, leaving behind only the echoes of a society that dared to believe it could conquer Greenland on its own terms. Their story forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Are we so different today? As glaciers melt and coasts flood, we face our own version of the Norse's dilemma. Will we double down on outdated systems, clinging to the familiar as the world changes around us? Or will we learn from the Inuit, adapting, innovating, and respecting the limits of the land? The Norse didn't vanish because Greenland was uninhabitable. They vanished because they couldn't imagine inhabiting it differently. Their empty churches and silent farms stand as monuments to the price of inflexibility. History's greatest mysteries aren't just about the past, they're mirrors. So tell us, which vanished civilization should we explore next? The builders of Cahokia's towering mounds, the Indus Valley's script-less scribes, or perhaps another chapter where humanity's hubris met nature's indifference? The answers are out there, waiting in the dust and the dark. All we have to do is look.